I know that as a little kid, I knew that I was safe to go to anyone's store and get a Band-Aid, get some water, get a juice box. And I know so many people around here who are like in their, 60s and 70s who have lived with their best friends on either side of them for like the last 30 years. And housing co-ops average $400 to $500 plus less in cost per month than regular market rentals. Good, affordable, safe housing with deep community connections should be available to everyone.
Welcome back to that
30 show.
Oh man.
We don't decide who says
know.
it. Like, so every time we're just like, we'll see what happens.
Whoever hops in first, whoever makes the face, the
yeah. Anyway, what's happening? What's going on? We got a guest episode today, but before we dive into that, anything exciting?
So something that's exciting is that happened way too quickly, but it's coming up on 4 years of me living like at my place, like moving out and living at my place. 4 years,
wow.
Which is crazy.
That's crazy.
Yeah, because I can remember it like it was yesterday. Like I moved out of my house, been living here for 4 years.
It's a big millennial/30s move.
Yeah. And I hadn't intended on staying here for that long. Like in my mind, I was like, 2 years, I'm going to move. 2 years, I'm going to move. But, with the interest rates that we currently have, it's a little bit difficult to move. And I had such a great rate solidified. And so I've been...
Oh, okay. So like you're kind of locked because the rates are so high, but you're locked in at a lower rate. You don't want to move because once you like sell and buy a new place, you're going to have to do a new mortgage and at the higher interest rates. Is that what you mean?
And so, I got a fixed mortgage. And so I'm going to have to wait it out until year 5 when hopefully it cools down a little bit. But I've been talking to a lot of people recently who have been renewing their mortgages. And they're just like, my monthly has gone up a lot. So,
well, at least you have a home. Like a 20% down for what is it? Like a 650, 700K these days? What is that? Like 150K? Where do you get that amount of money unless you have parental help?
Well, today we have on a guest who is going to provide us with another option. So, I purchased, David rents, and today we had Sarah Jensen on from the,
Co-operative Housing Federation of Canada.
Yes.
CHF.
Yes, CHF. Yeah. She came on to talk all about cooperative housing, which I had no idea what that was until I was introduced to it. At first I was like, co-op housing, is this the same as like the low income housing? And then I Googled it a little bit more and I was like, no, it's not. Is it a timeshare? Like, what is it?
What is it?
What is it?
I learned about it for the first time maybe half a year ago now, and it just blew my mind. I mean, obviously there's pros and cons depending on each person and your own values and your priorities and your situation. But the fact that there is even a third option that is, as Sarah sort of mentioned, is kind of an in-between traditional home ownership and renting, was just like a paradigm shift, right? It's kind of like we're so entrenched in our understanding of how home ownership works. Either you rent or you own. And it's hard to understand how it could be any other way. It was a fascinating conversation. I'll let you all draw your own takeaways from it, but without spoiling too much, what's one thing that stood out for you?
Well, one of the things that she emphasized was the community building around co-op housing, which I did not think that was going to be one of like a benefit. Yeah, because in my mind, it's always just like, okay, well, who profits from this? If it's affordable housing, how do we make the most? I never thought about the community piece of it. And it's one of the key aspects of co-op housing, which sounds super fun to me. Like I would love something like that. I don't know about you, but I would love to be in a co-op.
It definitely helps if you're more social. Yeah, it's like, if you don't want to talk to your neighbors, then maybe
it's just
maybe
like
not.
You would all know your neighbors. You'd gather all the time. You'd have a lot of fun. Like it sounds like its own little community, which sounds really exciting.
for me, the main takeaway was just the fact that there's folks who have lived in co-op housing for decades, like literally decades, 30, 40, 50 years, because no one's kicking you out. And so it's not like home ownership. It's not, but you do pay a monthly housing charge, but you live on your own terms. So yeah, if any of that sounds interesting and intriguing, but somewhat confusing to you as well, then stay tuned.
Well, and you don't have to worry about the 5-year mortgage rate renewal or whatever that I'm gonna have to go through next year.
Yeah.
So that's why people live in there forever.
Okay, well, with that, I hope you all enjoy our conversation with Sarah. Dun, 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 dun.
Oh my God, can you leave that in?
Okay. Welcome, Sarah, to That 30 Show. Thanks so much for your time today.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for inviting me on the show. I'm super excited to chat with you guys.
We're really excited to have Sarah Jensen join us today. She is from the Co-operative Housing Federation of Canada. But Sarah, why don't I let you introduce yourself a bit more about yourself, your role, and the organization.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much again. I'm Sarah Jensen. I am a director at large on the Co-operative Housing Federation of Canada's Board of Directors, which basically means that a bunch of different folks from housing co-ops all across Canada elected me to represent them. I grew up in cooperative housing in Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is in Northern Ontario. And so I kind of like have lived and breathed this since I was a little kid. And really know about like the experience of, living my whole life up until this point in a housing co-op, which is really unique. And so CHF works to promote the housing co-op vision of housing co-ops for all across Canada. And basically the idea is that we want all Canadians who want to have access to live in a housing co-op to give them that chance to do that, to live there.
So I'm very curious about this because up till maybe last week or whenever we asked you to come onto the podcast, I had no idea what a cooperative housing was. I have some friends who own their home, some friends who rent. And when this term cooperative housing first came up, I was like, what is that? I've never heard of this before. So maybe, like to start, if you could just tell us a little bit about what cooperative housing is.
Yeah, absolutely. So cooperative housing, I kind of like to pitch it to people who've never heard it as like sort of a hybrid between renting and owning your own home. What it is like a group of people who have come together to collectively purchase their homes. So that can look like, in my case, I grew up in a housing co-op that is a whole neighborhood of homes. They're townhouses. It was a group of people who came together, built townhouses, and now we all own them together as members. Or it can be an apartment building. It can be individual homes scattered throughout different neighborhoods. It can look like a lot of different things, but essentially at its core, it's a bunch of people who came together and said, hey, we want to own this as a group. And then sort of built into that, we have a democratic process. So in my housing co-op, for example, I was sat on the board for a number of years. I was elected to that position, and the board of the housing co-op makes decisions that are sort of more the day-to-day stuff. But every single person that lives in a housing co-op has what's called democratic member control. For example, once a year, we all have an annual general meeting where we get together and we say, hey, we are putting all of our money together, what we would put towards like rent in a renting situation, into this big pile. And we have, like, just to throw a number out there, $1 million to work with this year. What are we going to use that $1 million for? Are we going to use it for renovations? Are we going to use it for, throwing a community barbecue in the summer? Are we going to use it for paying staff to mow our lawns? Like it's completely up to the housing co-op and what they decide as a collective, how to run their housing co-op, how to live in their community together.
It draws a bit of parallels to when you do own a home and it's like a strata kind of situation, you have a bunch of people coming together and you do vote on things like that. But I guess maybe in a co-op, is it safe to say that the owners have more of a say because they just have an entire share of the land?
Yeah. So every single person that lives in a housing co-op is like a member owner. We just call them members. in sort of housing co-op lingo, but essentially that's what it means is like they own sort of a share of that pie. They own a share of the decision-making power, and together we all decide on what works.
So one of the main challenges that I found when I first tried to understand co-op is we're so entrenched, I think, especially we as in folks who didn't grow up exposed to this model at all, in the sort of capitalist understanding of how it works in terms of I own this or I don't own this. If I own this, then I can sell it for value later, depending if the market works for you, which in Canada, or at least in Toronto or Vancouver, certainly it does most of the time. I think that's the part that intrigued me the most. Can you tell us a bit more about exactly what you mean by own? Because I don't think you can, in the traditional sense, buy like this asset and then sell it for a higher value later. How does that work?
Yeah, so you're totally right. Like when you move into a housing co-op, you aren't buying in the traditional sense of like home ownership. There are some housing co-ops that are set up like that, but I'm talking more about like not-for-profit housing co-ops, which are the more dominant model, certainly in Canada, and are what I'm more familiar with. Like you're not buying in and you're not able to like sell your unit when you leave. You would get your deposit back the way you would with like any other renting-esque situation, but it's not that traditional capitalist sense of like, what am I going to be able to do to like flip this house to make it more valuable to, make that money in my pocket at the end of the day. But it does come with like a huge amount of stability that many people who would only be in the position to rent, not buy a home, wouldn't experience because of that collective ownership, because of that collective decision-making power. Housing co-ops stay at a much more stable rental, or in this case, housing charge rate than any other model. Most housing co-ops run at cost. So everything that goes into the running of the co-op is what is sort of how you set our rent. I put it in air quotes because it's actually called housing charges each month. So that means basically that it stays much more stable. So like, for example, I know folks my age in my city who, have watched their rent go up, like $500, $1,000 in the last like less than 5 years. And in my housing co-op, it's gone up less than $100. It's like just barely to match the rising cost of maintaining suitable, affordable housing. So that stability, I think, is like kind of one of the big perks of living in a housing co-op. I think that it gives you a lot more agency than traditional renting would, because you have that ability to lobby for, like what you want to see done in your housing co-op. You can stand up and say like, hey, I think we need new furnaces because our furnaces are 30 years old. And so that gives folks a lot more agency than what they would have with like traditional renting situations where they have to like, call their landlord. And I'm sure we've all heard like the horror stories that people have about dealing with the Landlord and Tenants Act and all of that stuff these days. But yeah, so I think that that's sort of the main difference of co-op ownership.
Yeah, you mentioned the idea of the the strained tenant-landlord relationship that often comes. Like I've heard so many of those horror stories. Like on TikTok, people are always talking about it.
Yeah.
So what happens in a co-op? Because there's so many people with, I guess, the ability to vote on things. They have more like power when it comes to a co-op situation. So what about the bad apples in a co-op situation? Like, how does that work?
Oh, do you get voted off the island, if you will? Like, or because a landlord might evict you, right? The worst case scenario. But is it possible to get evicted in a co-op if people don't like you, or because how does that work?
You can't get evicted from your home in a housing co-op if you're not liked in the community. That's definitely not something that happens at all. I think that that's like another plus of housing co-ops is definitely that like there are a lot more protections for folks so that it's much harder for them to like not be evicted. And there's so much support in housing co-ops to ensure that people can stay in their homes. Like if they're not able to pay their housing charges, housing co-ops will work with them and be like, hey, what's going on? What's going on with your family? How can we help as a community? How can we make sure that you're able to get back on track? But there are also lots of democratic processes. Like you were talking, G, about there being like, if you're dealing with like a bad landlord situation, in that case, one, we kind of are our own landlords in housing co-ops. So there's lots of democratic processes involved in terms of like if you are upset with how something is being run in the housing co-op, how you can go about that. You can write to the board of directors and say, this is an issue I think we're having that needs to be addressed. Can the board address it? You can stand up at your annual general meeting and say, hey guys, I'm not liking that this thing is going on, or I think we need to put more money and community effort into this particular aspect. Many housing co-ops also have staff. So like my housing co-op has like office staff. We have a general manager, we have a finance person, we have like a front desk person. That also provides an avenue. Like when we have maintenance stuff, we can call and be like, hey, we need maintenance to come look at the fact that the furnace isn't running, or my washer is only giving us cold water and not hot waters. There's lots of avenues that I think you don't have in traditional renting when you have to just go to your landlord or escalate it to the landlord tenant board.
Let me see if I understand this correctly, because I think I got snippets from you about this, but I'm not sure if that's the case. So at least for some of my friends I've talked to about renting and whatnot, that eviction, the stability, certainly wanting to find a landlord that is not going to make your life that difficult. That's one of the main reasons people don't want to rent, right? They don't want to be at the behest or the whims of someone that might like them or might not like them. And the idea of home ownership, traditionally anyway, is appealing for some people because they're like, oh, this is my forever home. This is on my terms. I'm not going to get kicked out. I can stay here for as long as I want. Do I understand correctly that you actually do get that stability with co-op too, in terms of like you've lived in co-op most or if not all your life?
Yeah, so actually my housing co-op is 50 years old. We just had our 50th anniversary last September. And I know people who moved in like day it opened, who lived here for that whole 50 years, who raised their family here, whose children got their own places here and are now raising their grandkids here, and, have lived in the same unit for that whole time, who have made it their own. And I also know a lot of people who have moved out, have bought their own homes, out of my own housing co-op in particular, have bought their own homes, were like, wait, actually, I liked living in the housing co-op better. I had more support from my community. I felt more connected to my neighbors. There was more resources to go around. I wasn't if my roof is leaking, it's not all on me to fix that roof. And have moved back because they actually much preferred the experience of living in a co-op to like personal home ownership. And of course, that's not for everyone. Of course, there's still going to be lots of people who do want to own their own homes, and that's totally valid. And honestly, I think there's a big discussion to be had. That's probably a whole other podcast on like millennials being able to afford to own their own homes, and that's really important.
Yes.
But yeah, in my opinion, I think that a lot of the things that are offered, a lot of the agencies that are offered in home ownerships are also offered in housing co-ops.
So I'm trying to picture myself like as a person who is looking to move out maybe from their parents' home for the first time, right? Like there's options. So one of them was to, purchase a home, which is getting to be a challenge here in Canada in particular, because it's very expensive. But also renting can also be really expensive. And like you said, there's a lot of drawbacks sometimes with renting and landlords and things like that. And now we've added a third option. When looking at all the different options, in your opinion, who should and shouldn't consider co-op housing as an option?
Well, I think for me, like one of the main tenets that I find in co-op housing, and is actually like sort of part of like the principles that are written into it, is like this sense of community involvement. There is a really deep sense of like knowing your neighbors, working together. There's a lot of emphasis on like member engagement, whatever that looks like for each person. Like I know as a very busy young person, it's really hard to get involved with things outside of like basically the necessities to live this day and age, right? But that said, like, I think it is a very community-minded space. So if you're somebody who wants to be connected to your community and to other people, it's a really great place to live. Oftentimes housing co-ops have, like neighbors close by. So if you're somebody who is going to be bothered by that, that might be not for you. There's lots of ways that you can be involved in your housing co-op, like everything from like being willing to shovel some snow, writing for your newsletter, just like volunteering to bake a pan of cookies for the once a year AGM. Like there's lots of ways to find that engagement and connection with other people. And I think that's also one of the really big strengths of co-op housing. At least it has been for me growing up. Like I moved into a housing co-op with my single mom when I was 7. I know that she survived that difficult transition time when she was becoming a single mom and raising a 7-year-old because she had the support of a whole bunch of community around her because she had so many neighbors. I know that as a little kid, I knew that I was safe to go to anyone's store and get a Band-Aid, get some water, get a juice box, whatever was needed. I was always really, really safe and really, really well looked after by the community at large. And that kind of grew into, as I grew up, like I was involved with my community garden here in Castle Green. We fed like families in the neighborhood who were, facing food insecurity, which is like a huge thing. And it's what's made me so excited to talk about the co-op model, because I think that there's a really distinct lack of that connection to community and connection to each other in this day and age on that level. And I'd love to see more of it.
I absolutely love everything that you said there. I feel very passionate about this point. So I want to elaborate on it just for a second here. I think this community aspect that you mentioned is easily overlooked or underrated for people who are trying to understand what co-op is. They're just like, oh, it's more affordable, which is certainly really, really great. But this community thing, you're absolutely right. Like, especially if you live in a big city, there's a lack of connection, and it's like we don't really know our neighbors. Like when people move to small towns, one of the first things that they'll tell me is like, oh, people actually say hi to each other on the sidewalks, and it can actually have a huge impact and positive contribution to your life if you're part of that. Kind of reminds me of the phrase when you raise a kid, like it takes a village, but then there's no village anymore. So like, how do you do that? So I definitely, I love that you expanded on that. I think it's a really great benefits of co-op housing from what I hear.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
My friends and I always talk about how, when we are older and maybe win the lottery one day, that we should all get houses that are right next to each other in and then we have our own little community friend group and we'll always be beside each other. And this kind of reminds me of that, because it sounds like everyone kind of knows each other. Everyone is friends, and you have that ability to connect with a lot more people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so funny that you say that, because I feel like that's really every like millennial and Gen Z person's dream these days. Like, it's just like, oh gosh, please, I would love this. I know that I've definitely talked about that with my friends, and what I do is I'm like, here's an application, please apply to the housing co-op. And I actually, my 2 roommates are 2 of my best friends for that reason. So like they're waiting on their own place on the wait list. And I know so many people around here who are like in their 60s and 70s who have lived with their like best friends on either side of them for like the last 30 years. So like that is also really cool to see that flex side. I know, right? Like that's like the dream. So yeah, it is kind of a really cool aspect of co-op housing for sure.
So you just mentioned applying or giving application forms to some of your friends to come join you in your community. Let's talk a bit more about that. Walk us through. How does that work? Is there eligibility criteria? Is there like application fee? Like, how do I get into a co-op if I'm already sold?
Okay, so I think, again, this is like something that's a little bit different for every single housing co-op across Canada. I think almost every single housing co-op that you could possibly apply to will have their application on their website, and we'll talk about their application process. So wherever your guys' listeners are, they'd look that up and be able to find it. But I can talk about what it was like for me. So for me, it was an application form, pretty standard stuff like my name and what I do for work and, that kind of stuff. The same sort of thing that you would put if we're applying to rent from somewhere, right? Sort of, I think maybe one of the unique things that a lot of housing co-ops ask is they do ask on those forms what you would like to be involved with in the housing co-op. So they have like my housing co-op has 2 pages, like list of like different things that you can do. If you have a passion for something that you can contribute to the community, that's sort of what they want you to put down there. because member engagement is such a hugely important part of how housing co-ops can keep down their costs and also how they can build that like really deep community connection that's like so fundamental to what housing co-ops are. That said, there isn't really like a legibility, like it's very rare that unless there is like a cap on the wait list for a housing co-op that you would be turned down for any reason. A lot of housing co-ops have subsidies, so even if you are low income, like the likelihood of you getting into a housing co-op is much higher than if you were just like applying for rental, because we are so focused on housing affordability and we, you know, have a lot of spots that are subsidized.
I guess I'm just trying to understand the financial aspect a little bit more. What about like just, this might be a dumb question, but what about just like month to month, you know, if there's no rent, but
yeah, so there are housing charges, which like essentially function the same as rent. You would pay like a monthly payment the way you would with rent. They're called housing charges, so it's a little bit like different on the legal end of things, but functionally, as a person living in a housing co-op, you can think of it very similarly. The difference being, though, that because housing co-ops are mainly operated at cost and because the increase of housing charges each year is voted on by the members. So like, I mean, obviously you are only voting to increase it enough so that like you can keep the housing co-op functioning. It's generally much more affordable than like comparable rent market housing in whatever city you're from. So I think the statistic that I have off the top of my head is there was a study done in 2022. They looked at like 5 major cities across Canada. It was like Toronto, Vancouver, Victoria, major cities where it's exceedingly expensive to rent. And housing co-ops averaged like $400 to $500+ less in cost per month than regular market rentals of comparable sizes.
So who actually owns the co-op? Because I guess you mentioned there are some nonprofits. Who owns it?
Technically, every single person who is a member of that housing co-op is an owner. There's 215 units. Collectively, as a household, the adults in this house own 1/215th of the housing co-op. So we have like 1/215th of a say.
So once it's built and everyone moves in, you're all sharing the ownership. That does make sense to me. I think that's okay. I wrap my head around that. I kind of almost think about it almost like a as you mentioned the word democratic many times. It almost sounds like it's like how a democratic government runs. Like everyone has a vote, but no one owns the government.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it.
As opposed to maybe an authoritarian piece of land where there's one person and there's only that one person who lives there and he owns that land and he rules it, but he gets no help. But he owns it. It's his. But maybe this is too technical, but I feel like some people will be interested to understand this, which is, but before it's built, one of the main challenges in a place like Vancouver or Toronto or any major city is the reason people want to build property is because it's so lucrative. They sell it for so much money. And so there's investors who have to be like, okay, I'm gonna take this gamble. I'm gonna put all this money in because I know I'm gonna get the benefits. So once it's built, I get that part. But before it's built, like, how does that work?
That's like a really good question because that's actually one of like the major challenges we face is like trying to build new co-op housing while competing with like a very competitive, very capitalist market that wants to like, you know, build housing for the highest amount of profit, never mind the people who are living in them. And so the last bit of funding we got was in the 2022 budget. It was $1.5 billion from the federal government set aside specifically for co-op housing. That was the first time that the government has set aside money specifically for co-op housing in 30 years. One of the main pieces that CHF Canada does is advocate to governments for additional funding to build more housing co-ops across Canada because affordable housing is such an important issue. And then also we do things like build land trusts where, you know, like a group of people will come together and they will buy up plots of land, or they will talk to municipalities and try and, you know, be like, hey, like we have an affordable housing issue in our community, in our city. Can we work with you guys to start building affordable housing that's sustainable, that focuses on community building and creating long-lasting solutions to the housing crisis by having access to this land? CHF and a lot of the work we do is around figuring out those solutions so that we can see more Canadians having access to housing co-ops, so that we can see more housing co-ops coming into existence.
I feel like it's an uphill battle but it's a very noble and necessary one. But because I think many of us know, we've seen those charts on TikTok and showing housing prices in UK versus US versus Canada, and Canada is uniquely crazy in terms of how they've turned housing, which I think most people or many people argue is a basic human right. They've turned housing into a profit-driven, I don't know what's the word, like a profit-driven mechanism.
Yeah,
it's almost like a market. It's like a Ponzi scheme, or where you're flipping assets based on speculation of of future value. And so, yeah, I imagine it's not easy to stop everyone who's just has dollar signs in their eyes and be like, actually, can we find another way to put roofs over people's heads that doesn't involve just making the most money possible, often at the cost of the working class people, working and middle class?
Well, it sounds like it would take, like, what Sarah mentioned, it takes a lot of people advocating. So not only those who work in, the co-op housing, like associations, but also even just citizens, like millennials like ourselves. It takes some advocating on that front, which also, like, speaking of which, because I had never heard of co-op housing before this, what is the demographic like, those who live in the co-op houses? Is it millennials? Is it some older folks? I don't know what the correct way to call them. What is that like?
Yeah, so I think that a lot of housing co-ops across Canada have a pretty decent percentage, like my housing co-op particularly, like 60% of our members are over the age of 60. So there's a lot of talk about, like, affordable housing for seniors as well. And that's like a super important piece. And we do a lot of work around, like, aging in place and how we can make housing co-ops more accessible, which is important for anyone of any generation, but, is a part of that advocacy as well. So there are lots of older folks, but I am seeing, like, more turnover into younger generations as well. Part of the problem with that is, like, people stay in their housing co-ops for a long time, which they absolutely should be able to do, because that's, like, I think it's so amazing to see folks who, gotten to have a stable home in a beautiful community that they've created for, 30, 40, 50 years. I think that's such a cool thing. And I think we should have more of that in, for everyone in every neighborhood. But we need more co-op housing because, one, we need more accessible and affordable housing so that older folks have that. And so, disabled folks of any generation have that accessibility. And we also need more co-op housing because there's so many long wait lists on housing co-ops all across Canada. Like, I signed up, like, the day I turned 18 to get my own unit, and I only just got a co-op, or like my own unit in Castle Green in this last year. It took a solid almost 8 years for me to come up on the wait list. And that's, like, pretty standard, like, for people to wait for years to be on a housing co-op list to get their own unit. That is because we need more units. There's so much demand for it, even with it not being a super commonly known thing, like you said, G. There's so much demand for it, and we need more of it. So that's why it's so important that we build more of it, is looking to be able to build that future of co-op housing, to have young folks who are students who are looking to raise their families, etc., in housing co-op.
It sounds like one of those models where once you're in it, you're basically in it for life. So I can see the need to build more, because then the barrier of entry is there. You just simply don't have enough to go around.
Absolutely.
The turnover rate is very low, right? Because there isn't any official limit or anything, which is obviously one of the huge advantages of the co-op housing model. That's an important detail for anyone who is considering it. Like, it's not just, you move in next month. Like, no, there's no turnover. Everyone wants to stay there for most of their life. And so you got to apply and hope to get lucky in a few years or something like that.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to discourage anyone from applying. Like, definitely, even if you're just considering it, like, put your name on some wait lists. You never know where you'll be when it comes up. And that said, also, like there are some new housing co-ops being built all across Canada that, are looking for new members. So definitely check out what's in your area and see what's available, because there are some lucky little pockets in there that have that advantage. In the 2022 budget, the federal government set aside $1.5 billion to go to housing co-ops. And so CHF is working with the governments right now to launch a program to build more co-op housing, which is super,
That's
super
awesome.
exciting. That said, like it's a continuous process of continuing to talk about it, continuing to get the word out about housing co-ops to the general public, because I think that a lot more people need to know about them, that they even exist in the first place, or that like the idea of them even exists, that there's an alternative between like ever increasingly unreachable home ownership and, the ever increasingly expensive and taxing renting. That there's an alternative for young folks to look at, I think is really, really important. And yeah, we're just like in a continuous process of continuing to advocate on sort of all levels to find more funding for more co-op housing. One of our mottos is like housing co-ops for all, which is something that like the CHF Canada membership came together in these like big conferences, which was super exciting. And I was a part of, which was really, really cool to get to go to these like big events with folks from all generations to talk about what we wanted to see for the future of co-op housing in Canada. And for us to come out of that with this vision for co-op housing for all, that's sort of the dream.
I can hear the passion in your voice, and and it's awesome. It's awesome that you're working for an organization that's promoting things like accessible and affordable housing, because I know we all need it, and it's great because like I mean, like I said, my friends and I have always talked about it. We just didn't even know that that was an actual thing that we could do, aside from winning a big chunk of money and buying land.
If that's what people take away, is that like this is a thing that exists. This is a thing that we as, like the average person can do. I would love that. I would love to see people see that. And like I think one of you mentioned too, like housing as a human right, like that is a huge part of the work we do as well. Like this idea that housing and good, affordable, safe housing with deep community connections should be available to everyone as a sort of right of course is very deeply embedded in the housing co-op, sort of movement and sector.
It just makes sense to me, like that should, right?
Like,
why is the ability to have roof over your head? I mean, I'm not talking about mansions, right? Everyone doesn't need a mansion, but like, having a decent roof over your head. Why is that left to the whims of the demand and supply capitalist market? It's just bizarre. But I'm so, really love the passion. And it sounds like there's a bright future for co-op, hopefully. The more people are talking about it and pushing the government and the wider society to like embrace this model, I think that's just all going to be all positive for the co-op housing movement.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I totally encourage anyone who's listening who's like more interested in this to, do your own research. I'm a big advocate for that. Look up what housing co-ops are in your area, give them a call, find out what they're doing, see if you can go to some of their events, because I know that like lots of housing co-ops open their events to wider communities so that people can see what it's like to live and be at a housing co-op.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for your time, for joining us all the way from Ontario. Just to end, is there any socials, any plugs, any websites, like where can people learn more about co-op or CHF?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's chfcanada.coop is our organization's website. So that is useful for any folks. You guys are based out of BC, out of Vancouver, right? Okay, yeah. So there's also CHF BC, the Cooperative Housing Federation of BC, and they have a lot of connections directly in Vancouver and in cities across BC as well.
And I believe if you go on the websites that you just mentioned, that's actually where you find the directory and listings of all the co-ops. So like on a map, you can just click on them and then go to the website, and that's where you would apply and find out more about what options are around your neighborhood, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So yeah, any housing co-op that is a member of CHF Canada will be listed on our website.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again, Sarah. I've definitely learned a lot today. So really appreciate you coming on and the work that you're doing. It's all great work.
Oh, thank you guys so much. It was so much fun to chat with you tonight. And I really appreciate you guys reaching out and having this conversation with me. It was a really great evening.
Of course. Thank you.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that conversation we just had with Sarah Jensen, and that you learned maybe something that you didn't know before, or that you're inspired to engage with co-op housing or think about it. We're not here to push it or not push it necessarily, but just trying to find different stories of how people live in their 30s, right? It's not just about homeownership. It's not just about renting. There is another option. Whether it's for you or not, only you can decide for yourself. But yeah, hope you all enjoyed that conversation. If you did, give us a rating on Spotify, subscribe on wherever you're listening to podcasts. Make sure you get a timely update about when we release our new episode, which we're releasing bi-weekly these days. So we're on YouTube. Give us a thumbs up and subscribe if you can. And let us know what you think. If you have any comments, you can leave a comment on Spotify. There's this little feedback thing there, Q&A, what you thought about it. You can always DM us at our Instagram at that30showpod, or the old-fashioned way, write us an email at that30showpod@gmail.com.